Hey guys, I'm Nate. Welcome back to the workshop. Iron Man is one of my favorite movies, and today we're going to be taking a look at how to build our very own Iron Man arc reactor nightlight. Let's go over the materials that we have and get started building. I do have quite a few items on the workbench at the moment, but most of them are low cost and easy to get your hands on. I have a can of some seaside colored spray paint. I've got some black and some gold acrylic paint, a simple paintbrush. This cutting board I think was 88 cents at Walmart, and about the same cost for this small strainer. These little touch lights come in a pack of 2 for $8 or $9 at Walmart. Sitting underneath our touch light is a piece of foam core board. These of course usually come in much larger sheets. I've just cut a small piece off because that's all we're gonna need for this build. I have a strip of staple gun staples, a standard key ring, 3 small hex head screws, some copper wire. This other mat underneath the rest of this stuff is also supposed to be a form of cutting board. It's sold in a 3-pack for about $1, and it's just a thin, flexible plastic. I have a circle compass, an X-Acto knife, a glue gun, and I have this tool which is designed for punching holes and setting hardware in leather. Really, I'm just going to be using the one tool that punches out a small hole. It's a little bit smaller than a standard hole punch. If you don't have one of these, you can easily use a drill bit or a small hot nail for the holes that we need to punch. It's just going to be used on our thin orange plastic. The first pieces we need to make are some circles cut out of our thick cutting board, and they need to be the same diameter as our touch light. We want to cut out 2 circles. One will just be a disc that's the exact same size and shape as the surface of our touch light. The second piece will be a ring that almost perfectly matches this white border going around our light. For the solid disc, we can easily just trace out the light and it will give us a disc just the right size. But because we want to add a border on the other one, let's try using a compass just the right size to measure out the first circle, and then keeping our center in the right spot, we can measure out a smaller circle within it. Now the diameter of this light appears to be just barely under 3 inches. So if we set our compass to be just under 1.5 inches, we should get a circle that's the same size as the diameter of our light. The specific measurement of our ring should be just exactly the width of the inside of our staples, because our staples are later going to fit over this ring. It's kind of funny how this ring looks larger than this one because it's measured on the outside and this one is drawn at the exact interior diameter. But really these two should come out being the exact same size. Cutting boards are designed to be tough, and they're designed to hold up to things like knives and blades. So this board can be a little bit tricky to get through. However, there are a lot of tools that can cut it really easily. If you have a hole saw the right size, that would do a great job. However, in the interest of saving time for the video, I got my hands on a scroll saw and I'm gonna use that to cut these pieces out. There's our first disc. I want to cut out the inside first, and of course I can't just pass the blade through, but these blades are designed to come off and on really easily. So what I'll do is drill a hole into the plastic, take the blade off, fit it through the hole, and then reattach it on the scroll saw. There we go, our ring is now cut out. Let's clean this up with a little bit of sandpaper and then we'll be ready to move on. Now the reason I chose to use this cutting board material is that it's strong, rigid, and it's excellent at diffusing light. So what we're going to do is have the disc and the ring both sit above our touch light, and they should give a nice muted glow without being too intense. The arc reactor in the movie has a slight blue tint coming off of it, so let's take our solid disc and paint one side of it with that aqua blue spray paint we have. We can now see that we get a nice, soft, slightly blue glow. Just what we're looking for. We now want to take our ring and modify it so that it has 10 points going around the circle of what seem to be magnetic coils of some kind. To do that, we're going to be using our staples and our copper wire. Each of the 2 points will use 2 staples, so let's break 20 staples off of this stick that we have. We'll want to place our staples over our ring, flip it over, and then crimp them down so they're holding on tightly to the ring. We should have less than 1 centimeter of a gap in between the two staples. Once the staples are really well pressed down, they should hold themselves in place pretty well. You could maybe move them if you tried hard, but overall, they're going to stay where you put them. Now let's put another set of staples directly across from the first set. With our first 2 sets of staples installed, we now need to evenly space out 4 more sets around on each side of them. Hopefully the staples are holding on nice and tight to your plastic ring, but if some of them are a little bit loose, you can easily just use a dot of hot glue to hold them in place. Now that we have all of our staples attached to our plastic ring, we need to wrap some of our copper wire around the plastic in between the sets of staples. Let's cut off about a 2-inch section that we'll use to wrap around. That way we won't have to pass all of our wire through our ring as we do the wrapping. So now, on the back of our ring, let's put a small dab of glue in between 2 of the staples. We'll then press our copper wire down into that glue. If you're using really hot glue, make sure you don't do that with bare fingers, it will hurt. Wrap that around once, cross it around the back, and then wrap it down a second time. And we now have a nice coil of wrapped copper wire in between our 2 staples. So on the back again, let's trim off the excess so it doesn't wrap around further. And then we'll glue down the ends of our copper wire. And look at that, we have our little electromagnet driving our arc reactor, or whatever that thing is. Like I said, it's not very clear the exact function. So now we just need to do that 9 more times. There we have it, all 10 of our sections are now wrapped with our copper wire and our ring is looking pretty good. On the inside of the arc reactor, there are a few concentric rings building up from a spot in the middle that has sort of a mesh grid over it. We'll be using the metal mesh from this sieve as the grid on the bottom of the arc reactor, and we'll be cutting some concentric rings out of this plastic for the rings that build up inside the arc reactor. To begin, let's cut off the mesh from this sieve and flatten it out as best we can so that we can measure a flat circle rather than a domed one. There we go. Now fortunately this stuff is quite flexible. To measure out the size that we want that circle to be, we're going to make it match the key ring that we'll be using. This will actually end up getting attached to the arc reactor a little bit higher up, but it's a perfect measure for the size that we want this circle to be. We now need to cut out 5 concentric rings, the smallest of which should fit nicely right over our silver mesh, the largest of which should just barely be smaller than the interior diameter of our plastic ring. We're going to want the smallest ring to slightly overlap the edge of our mesh. So if we make our first circle just slightly smaller than that, we should be able to make the outside of it just slightly larger, and then it will completely cover the edge. So that right there will be the size of our first ring. And now we need to have 4 more of the same thickness extending from it. There we go, our 5th ring, and we can see that it just barely fits inside the plastic ring with the copper wound around it. We need to use our X-Acto knife and very carefully cut out around each of those circles we just drew. So now we've got our 5 circles of ascending size, and we need to change them to the right color. The pieces in the movie look like they're probably made out of brass, so let's use a nice golden brass colored paint and change these to look like they're made of metal. I'll first add a black base coat onto the plastic, as I think that will make the gold show up a little bit nicer. Our 5 plastic circles are now painted and look nice and brass colored. Now we need to find a way to attach them at an ascending angle onto our arc reactor. Our smallest ring needs to be attached to our mesh circle, and that will get glued down on the center of our plastic disc. We're going to want to suspend our ring a little bit above the disc down below, so let's cut out 3 pieces of our foam core board that will act as struts, holding the ring up above the disc. Our big plastic ring will sit supported up above these pieces, but we want our smaller brass-colored concentric rings to sit nested down inside, going from the bottom up to the height of the top ring. So now we want to cut from that point down to where our foam core board touches our smallest inner brass ring. And of course, we want to cut all 3 pieces to match that. I have here an equilateral triangle that I cut out using a compass and a ruler, and I'm just going to use that to mark what points to put these supports on so that they're evenly spaced around our circle. Now let's quickly hit the sides and sloped parts of these supports with some black paint. Now that we have our supports painted, what we're going to do is glue our rings so that they're touching the supports and stack nicely on top of one another. The angle that we've cut the supports out should keep them perfectly spaced as it ascends from one size ring to the next. The next piece we need to make is a slightly thicker ring that will go above all of these. This will have holes going through it all the way around, and it's what our hexagonal headed screws will fit into. At its widest, it should have the same diameter as our top ring, but it will be much thicker, so its inner diameter will be considerably smaller than our top ring. We now need to use our hole punch and punch holes going all the way around this ring to make sure that I have 3 that are evenly spaced out. I'm going to use my little equilateral triangle again and just put 3 marks of where I want those holes to go. It'd also be helpful to me to have an inner line that will show where the edge of the hole should go, so I don't end up having one hole right here and one hole right here, so I keep it in one nice smooth straight line. Now I have 3 evenly spaced holes, and I need to fill in all of the gaps between them. With our holes punched, we can now take our hex head screws and thread them down through the hole into the plastic. You can now get a good sense of how this is going to work, but the only pieces we still need to cut out are some support struts that go from our 3 hex head screws into the middle to hold up our silver ring. We'll cut those pieces out of some more of this semi-rigid plastic. We can see that we aren't going to need those pieces to be very long. They only have to reach from the hex head screw to the edge of our key ring. Let's add holes into the end of each of these 3 tabs, and then we'll bend them to give a little bit of a different shape to hold up our ring slightly lower than the plastic ring with the holes in it. Now I'm going to use the back edge of this razor blade to add a couple of bends into our plastic. So now we need to attach each of these 3 tabs onto their respective screws. It fits nicely over the screw, and let's just add a little bit of hot glue to keep it firmly in place. With our 3 supports in their spots, we can drop in our little ring, and now we can mark where we need to cut off the extra plastic. Now let's add a little bit of glue on all of those edges and affix our ring permanently. We do have a little bit of overlap, so let's take our X-Acto knife and just try and trim a little bit of that off. There's our center ring. Now let's use a little bit more of our paint and paint everything that's orange to be black. At this point, it's time to start the final assembly on the piece. So first, let's glue the outer ring onto the support structure around it. Now the way that these are spaced out, our little hex screws will rest nicely right on top of the highest golden ring. So we just need to add a little dab of glue to the bottom of each screw and then affix it onto those rings. Let's cut 3 small support pieces out of our foam core board, glue them on, and then paint everything black before gluing this onto the supports. Then we'll attach the smaller black and silver rings into the center. In a dark room, this lights up beautifully. This, of course, is more of the display piece arc reactor than something you would want to wear as a costume. It's fairly wide overall, but you would be able to follow these exact same principles and just make everything shorter if you were trying to make a version that you could maybe mount to your chest as part of a costume. Tony Stark built one of these in a cave. Now you can build your own with just a quick trip to Walmart and a couple of tools. Thanks for joining us for this video, and remember to come gear yourself up with hats, shirts, and other cool merch at thekingofrandom.com. See you there. Interesting, drawing black on top of the silver mesh. It doesn't really look like it's black, it just looks like it's invisible almost. That almost perfectly matches this edge on the, oh, there it goes.